imposing philosophy on Scripture. A lot of times, Molinists or non-Calvinists get accused of doing this sort of thing. Is that the case? That's something we're going to tackle today on FreeThinking Ministries. Welcome. My name is Josh Klein. It's good to have you here. I am your host, not as always, but as usual, as per usual, and I am joined by Dr. Tim Stratton to address this very question. Dr. Stratton, how are you today?
Doing great, Josh. How are you?
I am doing just fine. So we are going to jump into it, but before we jump into it, we do want to ask people to like this video, to subscribe to the channel. I want to share an interesting statistic with you guys that only 23.7% of the people who watch this channel are subscribed. If you watch the channel, just go ahead and subscribe. Just do it right now. Hit that notification bell so that you cannot miss an episode. We are going to be diving deep into objections to Molinism, specifically objections to mere Molinism. Tim Stratton, enter the Stratton verse, as some people have called it. And we are going to look at these objections. The first of them today is that we impose philosophy upon Scripture.
Molinists, like me, are often accused of starting with philosophy and then imposing it upon Scripture. It seems to me, however, that shoe is on the other foot. That is to say, it seems to me that it's Calvinists who are guilty of starting with a philosophical position and then they impose that upon Scripture. So, for example, in my debate against James White, I made a biblical case for mere Molinism, which, by the way, was never addressed, but that's another topic. But what is the biblical case for exhaustive divine determination, or what I call EDD or ED? How in the world does one infer ED from Scripture? What is the biblical case for exhaustive divine determination?
And I hear this one a lot. Tim, before we jump into it, I remember, I think I told you one of the pastors that I work with, when I first mentioned Molinism, said, "Oh yeah, that's more philosophical than exegetical, isn't it?"
That's right.
Yeah, and so that sent me on my I guess, crusade to prove that this is not the case. And so that's what we're doing today.
All right.
So first of all, you have kind of coined some terms. So let's get into that first. Many Calvinists, they seem to kind of lose their minds over the term ED, or exhaustive divine determinism. So you've often referred to those responses as the wailing and gnashing of teeth, which then gets them to wail and gnash their teeth even more because you said that. Now, anyway, that's neither here nor there. But many have said that there's no point in using ED. It's either determinism or it's not. And so you are being superfluous. How would you respond to that?
Well, yeah. Now, first of all, using the word exhaustive helps people understand exactly what we're talking about. I found this to be the case even among PhD philosophers who are discussing this topic with me. In fact, recently I read a forthcoming paper that I co-authored with Phil Kahlberg, and we were discussing this topic at the Evangelical Philosophical Society. And I even there, in a room full of PhD theologians and philosophers, many of them were confusing the idea that some things are determined with all things are determined. For example, people confuse soteriological determination with exhaustive determination all the time. Many times people don't factor mental actions into their view of determinism. And I've found this to be the case so often when I'm having these discussions, even with other academics. Indeed, the people who are complaining about me seeking clarity with the use of the word exhaustive are often the same ones guilty of muddying the waters in the first place. I've never seen so many folks, as you mentioned, gnashing their teeth because I've sought to bring clarity to a very confusing situation, a situation that where they've caused the confusion in the first place. So it's really mind-blowing to me how upset people get because I use the term exhaustive divine determinism or determination. It's mind-blowing to see people freak out especially when I abbreviate this as ED. So with that said, let me be clear. I'm not against some or even most things being determined. I hold a position similar to Robert Keynes, and I simply argue that the entirety of human mental actions cannot be determined, and that we must possess libertarian freedom if we're to possess metaphysical and theological knowledge. Now, after hearing this clarity, the philosophers at the EPS meeting, at the Evangelical Philosophical Society meeting just recently, after hearing this clarification, they had zero problems with this term. It really only seems to be an issue with non-philosophers on the internet. Now, secondly, recently, to avoid some of these objections to me seeking clarity, I've used the term exhaustive divine determination instead of exhaustive divine determinism. In fact, recently, I've intentionally used that term in discussions online, but it doesn't seem to matter. But I'll just note that I'm not the only academic who has referred to some things being determined as determinism as opposed to all things. I mean, even Robert Mueller, I was just reading some of his work the other day, and I noticed that he was using and distinguishing between all the kind of determinism where all things are determined and the kind of determinism where just some things are being determined. Now, I get it that those who specialize, the philosophers who specialize in this field, when they use the term determinism, they probably are meaning all things exhaustively, so they don't need to use the word exhaustive. But my audience is much more than the handful of people who are writing and contributing to the literature on this topic. It's to other philosophers as well, other theologians, and even to those laymen who are just getting into this field. I want them to understand exactly what we're talking about. So that's why I use the term exhaustive. I've found it to be extremely helpful.
Okay, so I think that's helpful. I was also just going to say, it's your ministry, what we have built here at FreeThinking Ministries, what you have built has not just been it is academic, but it's not been primarily academic. It's kind of taking the academic to the lay people. Some people call that a popularizer, and some people use popularizer as like almost a pejorative for people who aren't as intellectual or whatever. But every thought system needs a popularizer, so we understand. Yeah. So people go, okay, I hear that word, but what does it mean? So I think that's fine. Now, some people, let's say someone said that everyone uses in the literature, everyone uses this term, theological determinism. Yeah. So we should just use that term since that's the predominant understanding. Let's say they're like, when I took a class in philosophy, determinism, this is how it was defined. It's either naturalistic determinism or theological determinism. You don't need ed. Maybe they even say, hey, saying ed is a mouthful because exhaustive divine determinism is a mouthful. But so why not just say theological determinism? So how would you respond to that objection as we talk about importing philosophy?
Yeah, well, first, this objection ignores J.P. Moreland and my contributions to the literature, to the academic literature, because of the confusion over what theological determinism can mean to some people. So, exhaustive divine determinism, or ED, is officially entered into the literature now, and to pretend otherwise is either ignorant or intentionally ignoring what's out there. Now, J.P. Moreland and I have introduced the term ed into the academic literature in an attempt to purify the previously muddied waters. So it's out there. And by the way, ed is not superfluous, nor is it a mouthful. I've heard one guy recently on YouTube complain that that exhaustive divine determinism, or ED, is a mouthful. But look, when you say ED, it's one syllable. And so this objector said that he'd rather use the term theological determinism, but that's 10 syllables as opposed to the one syllable of ED that I'm using. So it's much easier to just say ED, get clarity, purify the previously muddied waters, and save time in the process. As far as I'm concerned, it's a win-win. Look, at the end of the day, I don't care if objectors use the term ED, as long as everyone in the conversation and everyone trying to follow along knows exactly what I mean. That's the most important thing.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. Also, but I will say this: one of the objections I would have to the term ED is I know a lot of people named Ed, and they don't want to be confused with with your philosophy.
Well, I'll say this: I've also found it helpful to help or to show people that it was really Jonathan Edwards who I think really did the best of promoting this view. I don't think it was common in Reformed circles during the Reformation. I definitely don't think Luther held the view of exhaustive divine determinism. I know that Melanchthon, who I've referred to as the rock star systematic theologian of the Reformation, he rejected ED. It's really Jonathan Edwards, post-Reformation, who really advanced this view that is now often conflated and called Calvinism. So, but it's easy to remember because you got Edwards and Ed. So if you want to remember Edwards' view, just think of Ed.
Okay, so I think we've gotten into that. That's why we use the term. One of the things I think I've said to you about that term is, okay, even if it is redundant, so what? Academics are redundant all the time for clarity. It seems to me like this is just kind of an attempt to discredit rather than an attempt to actually argue on the merits of the case. And so it's kind of like, okay, you don't have to like Ed. That's fine. That's the word I use to clarify what I mean. But if we spend the entire time debating whether or not this term should even be a term, then we don't actually get to what it's supposed to explicate. So that's one of the things I would say.
I've said that too. So what? Like, oh, that term is redundant. So what? Deal with my argument. Deal with what Ed is referring to, with that concept. That's what matters, not the term.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I've heard it said that determinism is not taught in the Bible. In fact, you had a whole debate about whether or not Molinism is biblical. But I've heard someone say that determinism is not taught in the Bible, but that determinism is compatible with the Bible. How would you respond to that?
I would say absolutely not. Determinism is not compatible with the whole of Scripture. In fact, it opposes the whole of Scripture. Phil Kalberg and I, as I just mentioned, recently made a case that Ed undermines the gospel clearly taught in Scripture. I recently had the opportunity to read this paper, like I said, to a room packed with PhD philosophers and theologians, many of whom were Ed Calvinists, and a fantastic exchange during the Q&A ensued. And let's just say that the case that Kalberg and I made stood strong at the end of the day. This essay will be published in an academic journal article. Sorry, this essay will be published in an academic journal soon. So stay tuned for that.
Awesome. Yeah. And I kind of want to throw my hat in the ring here too, because one of the reasons that one of you know this, you and I have talked, I think, for 3 years about me pursuing doctoral studies and stuff like that. And it looks like it's finally getting there's finally rubber meeting the road as far as that goes. But one of the things that I am attempting to do is, hold on, let's pause. Yeah, and you know this, and we've talked, I don't know, for like 3 years about me doing doctoral research, right? And one of the reasons that I wanted to get into it was this conversation of what is compatible with Scripture, because actually that is a good question to ask. So one of the questions that I want to ask at the beginning is one of the statements I'm going to assert and argue at the beginning is that everyone brings a philosophy to Scripture when they read it. Every person does, even children. They bring whatever rudimentary philosophy they have in their minds, because that's how we understand. That's how we understand the text. And so then the question isn't, should we bring philosophy to the text? The question is, well, which philosophy makes the best sense of what God has revealed of himself in the text? And I think, so I want to walk through that in my research, and I'm looking forward to doing that. But I think that's kind of what you're saying here is, even if we could make the case that determinism is compatible with Scripture, we have to see if it's compatible with all of Scripture, and whether or not a different system makes more sense and is more I don't know if more compatible is the right word, but is it makes more sense of Scripture. So so that's kind of what I'm working on, and I know you're excited about that. I'm excited about that. I'm sure people will dislike that, but that's what makes for good research, right?
That's right.
All right. So now you had a debate with James White. What did we discuss? Like 2.5 years ago, almost 3 years ago?
Yeah, it was 2022, February of 22.
Yeah, man, time flies. It was just when I was coming on to FreeThinking Ministries, I think.
Yeah.
Like just the very beginning. And you had a debate with him. And some people have said that in your debate with him, you merely wanted to make the case that Molinism was compatible with the Bible, as if that's a bad case to make. Like, okay, that's fine. It could be compatible with the Bible, but it could also be derived from Scripture because it makes the most sense of Scripture. Anyway, is it true that that's the only case that you were making, that it was that modest of a claim?
No, actually, I made a stronger case than that. Just as James White makes a case that the Trinity is not merely compatible with the Scriptures, but it's the only logical way to make sense of all the biblical data, I used White's exact same methodology to show that Molinism was the only way to make sense of all the biblical data. So in that debate, I said, if the Trinity is biblical, then Molinism is biblical. So let me quote myself here from that debate. I said the following: I contend that Molinism is biblical and Ed is not biblical. Consider my argument. Premise 1. If Scripture implies both, A, humans occasionally possess libertarian freedom, and B, all human activity is predestined before creation, then Scripture implies Molinism. 2, Scripture implies both A and B. 3, therefore, Scripture implies Molinism. And then then I added, this syllogism is valid. So if the premises can be supported by Scripture, then any Bible-believing Christian rejecting Molinism seems to be in opposition to what the Scriptures teach, end quote. So in this debate, I argued that both libertarian freedom and exhaustive predestination are inferred from the biblical text. As far as I can tell, the only way to make sense of human libertarian freedom and exhaustive divine predestination is Molinism. Indeed, in my opening statement in the James White debate, I could not have been more clear. I said, contention number 4, middle knowledge is the only way to predestine a libertarian free choice. So there you have it.
Okay, so let's dig into that a little bit more. First, I want to say to people that if you haven't watched the debate, you can watch the debate. It is on our YouTube. You can find it, James White versus Tim Stratton debate. We've talked about the debate. We're going to talk about the debate again here soon, just kind of looking back on it, maybe some different things that you might do now as opposed to then, that sort of thing. It should be fun. So we're going to get into that a little bit more. But before we do that, I want to invite you, the viewer, to be a part of the team. And how I want to invite you to be a part of the team is I want you to go to www.freethinkingministries.com and find all of the articles, all of the things that we have there on Molinism, on things in the culture. We do that so that we can help people think reasonably about all things in life. In fact, our mission is to help people reason together by applying logic and sound theology to all areas of life. And you can find that on our website, on our YouTube channel, but you can be a part of the team as well. If you go to www.freethinkingministries.com/donate, you can be a part of the team. You can sign up for our newsletter, and you can get more information about where we're going to speak, what we're going to be doing. Please consider doing that today. That's www.freethinkingministries.com/donate. We're only funded. We're not funded by Patreon. We're not funded by anything else. We're only funded by people who want to see the ministry continue to grow and who want to see God glorified in that way. So please do that today. All right. Let's move on with that. There's the plug. So in the question with James White and saying why you're only making compatibilism, you're only making a compatibilist claim with Molinism. Why even ask the question that you're asking?
Well, first, because folks like James White and his ilk constantly accuse Molinists of starting with philosophy and then imposing it upon Scripture. So this question is aimed at exposing the fact that this shoe is actually on the other foot. And that's one good reason to ask the question. Second, because I see nothing in God's inspired word that affirms or implies ed. I see the exact opposite. And this is especially clear when one realizes that predestination does not necessarily entail determination, which I deductively conclude in my book on Mere Molinism. In fact, ed, as I've shown, contradicts Scripture and undermines the gospel. So asking this question begins to expose that as well. So there's at least two really good reasons to ask that question, to the chagrin of this objector.
Okay, so I think that's a good explanation. So some have tried to get around your arguments by affirming a view referred to as compatibilism. And first of all, I'd say even if someone is bringing philosophy to the text, there's a difference between bringing philosophy to the text and seeing if it's compatible or derived from the text than it is to impose philosophy onto the text and make it fit, right? There's a difference there. So even if you're trying to see if Molinism is compatible, that implies that you are looking at Scripture and saying, okay, does Molinism fit in Scripture? Not can Scripture fit my Molinism? That's a different thing. And when you say the shoe's on the other foot, you're saying when somebody who believes in ed goes to Scripture, what they're doing is actually the second thing. They're actually taking the Scripture and fitting it in, shoehorning it into a preconceived philosophy. That's the difference. Right. That's the difference, right? So I just want to clarify that for anybody that is kind of going, well, what's the difference? That's the difference. When we say everyone brings a philosophy to the text, not everyone is going to impose their philosophy onto the text. Yeah. They're going to say, okay, here's my philosophy. This is what the text says. Oh, wait, that's not what it teaches. I'm going to adjust my philosophical viewpoint. All right. So anyway, back to compatibilism. So some people have tried to get around that by referring to compatibilism. Does that get divine determinists off the hook in any sense?
Yeah. I've been clear in my writings that compatibilist freedom entailing my specific choice is determined by antecedent conditions might describe some of the choices we make some of the time. It just cannot describe all of them. Hence the term ed, exhaustive divine determinism. Yes, I contend that some kinds of freedom are compatible with ed. I also show and deductively conclude that theological knowledge is not compatible with ed. Theological knowledge is incompatible with ed. Don't miss that. That's huge, right? So for one to respond, but I'm a compatibilist, well, that's just nonsensical. Compatibilism is, let me give you an official definition here. Compatibilism is the thesis that some kind of freedom and or moral responsibility is compatible with determinism, right? So the arguments I've advanced along with J.P. Moreland show that metaphysical and theological knowledge are not compatible with determinism. So while the compatibilist is referring to things like some kinds of freedom and or moral responsibility, J.P. Moreland and I are talking about theological knowledge and metaphysical knowledge being compatible with determinism. So those are two different things. We're discussing two different things. And so often when I point out that theological and metaphysical knowledge is incompatible with ed or exhaustive determinism. The Calvinist will say, but I'm a compatibilist. Well, that doesn't matter because you're talking about different things. So I'm showing what's not compatible with determinism, and others are trying to say, but other things are compatible with determinism. It doesn't work. So yeah, we're discussing two different things. They're conflating two different ideas, and they're attacking a straw man in the process. So a big mess. That's why I'm so just so focused on clarifying exactly what I mean by the different terms I'm using.
Okay, so let me play devil's advocate for a second here. All right, if I can. So then, attempted response to your question, and the only reason why I'm doing this one, it's devil's advocate, is because I know we've heard this one a lot. I know you've heard it quite a bit. I've heard it quite a bit, but many people will say that they fail to see a meaningful difference
Right.
between Calvinism and Molinism. In fact, some of our open theist friends might even say
Right.
that same thing. There's not a meaningful difference between Calvinism and Molinism because all things are still determined in a sense, right? Like God created,
Well,
and
that's-
since God created, and we have no ability to do otherwise, according to what they're saying, then we can't do otherwise. So Molinism is illusory, and so there's not really it just kind of kicks the can down the road, right? So they're saying there's not a meaningful difference between Calvinism and Molinism. Well, how would you respond to that?
Well, I guess I'd say, tell me you're not a philosopher without telling me you're not a philosopher. The vast majority of times, it's not PhD philosophers who make this objection. This is something that is common in the online sphere, but most philosophers will be able to tell you exactly what the differences are between Calvinism and Molinism, and that's why Calvinists like Guillaume Bignon, a great PhD philosopher, rejects Molinism because he is committed to Calvinism. He sees the difference, and that's why he's not a Molinist. It's also why philosophers like William Lane Craig, who affirm Molinism, reject Calvinism because they can see a clear difference. I see a clear difference, and for those who can't see it, you got some more homework to do. It's really pretty clear. You know, I recently heard a YouTuber say that Molinism doesn't get God off the hook of evil. And this is just evidence that this YouTuber has not read the current literature, or at least doesn't understand it, some of which I helped to contribute to in academic journals. So I've got an entire journal article addressing this topic in the journal Perichoresis. In fact, Michael Jones, aka Inspiring Philosophy, appealed to this journal article in his recent debate with the apostate Tyler Vela. Now, it definitely highlights meaningful differences between Molinism and Calvinism. And if there's no meaningful difference, then I invite all Calvinists to become Molinists and Molinists to become Calvinists. That's not going to happen because most of us see the difference. But as you said, even some open theists struggle with this and think that Molinism is still determinism, but it's not. That's why Calvinist determinists who understand this refuse to be labeled Molinist. So it's often, it reminds me of my conversations with Mormons when I do ministry in Utah. The assertions I hear from Mormons, they'll often say that there's no meaningful difference between Protestant evangelical churches and the Mormon church. And then I say, well, or they'll say, we're all Christians. But then I invite them to refer to themselves as evangelical Protestant Christians if there's no difference. Well, they don't do that. And because they know there is a difference, even when they're saying, oh, there's not really a meaningful difference. I'm like, well, then come to church with me, to the evangelical church. Well, of course they're not going to do that because they know the differences, even though they're trying to say there's not really a difference here. But these Calvinists who claim that there's no difference between Calvinism and Molinism will also never claim to be a Molinist. And this is because they are fully aware of the differences between the two views. So it's a tad disingenuous. I think really the only people, I don't think Calvinists should appeal to this at all. I think the open theists are the only ones who, even though they're wrong to make this conflation and to not see the difference, they're mistaken. I see that they're really the only ones who should advance this view, or at least bring this objection up. But sadly, I see a lot of Calvinists make it, but they'll never become Molinists. And if they say there's no difference between the two, then I think they're being disingenuous. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And what you're saying with the open theist is, at least they, even if their argument is incorrect, they at least have a stronger leg to stand on to offer the argument,
Yes.
because of their belief in the openness of God is very different, as far as God's omniscience and
Yeah.
and those metaphysical matters, where there is Molinism and Calvinism are very different, but there are enough similarities that it can get confusing for people. So
Yeah. Molinism and Calvinism are related. What we share in common is that God predestines all things, and that God knows the future and even knows the truth to counterfactual statements, things like that. But we both affirm the divine decree that God has decreed all that will occur, but that all that will occur does not necessarily occur. That's what the Molinist says. The Calvinist wants to say, no, all that happens necessarily occurs. That's where we break. So we affirm that God predestines all. What we disagree with is the Calvinist says that God determines all, and the Molinist says, no, God does not determine all. An event is determined. Here's another official definition. An event is determined if antecedent conditions are sufficient to necessitate said event. And so the Molinist rejects that and says there's a difference between what will happen and what will happen necessarily. The Calvinist conflates the two. The Molinist says no. The open theist is often confused by this, and well, we'll get to that later.
Yeah, we will. Okay, so on a related note, again, plain devil's advocate. I know you've heard this one a lot, but how about Greg Welty's bullet bill tu quoque objection? Is that a good objection?
Well, I like how you worded that question, Josh. It depends upon the manner in which one uses it, and to whom it's offered, and in what situation, right? So the manner in which Greg Welty uses it, I contend, is not a fallacious move. It's not a fallacy. He's a good philosopher. I believe, understands how to use it in a way that's not fallacious. And because his audience is Molinists, who see problems with Calvinism, right? So his approach is to say, okay, fine, Molinists, but it seems to me that Molinists have the same problems as Calvinists. And I've argued that Molinists escape those problems, but that's the approach that Welty is taking here. So it's not fallacious, but many online objectors who aren't philosophers, who appeal to Welty's bullet bill objection, they do use it in a fallacious manner. So, just recently, while engaging in that Q&A at the EPS, I was engaged in dialogue with some PhD Calvinists there, whom I highly respect, and one of them made this same fallacious mistake during the Q&A after I gave a presentation about how Calvinism opposes the gospel and undermines the gospel and opposes the clear teachings of Scripture. And rather than defend his Calvinistic view, this philosopher argued, but what about Molinism? In a situation like this, he is appealing to, or I guess I would say, and he did bring up Bullet Bill, by the way, but appealing to Bullet Bill in a situation like this is fallacious. Let me explain why. First, this is because I'm not making a case for Molinism in that situation. Yes, I'm a Molinist, but in that setting, I was not making a case for Molinism. I was making a case against Calvinism, full stop. And so to respond, well, if it's a problem for me, I know your views that you haven't talked about here. It's also a problem for you. Look, when one does that, that's a fallacy. Second, as I expressed during that Q&A discussion, after the philosopher appealed to Welty's bullet bill objection, I noted that I'm simply making a case against Ed. I'm not making a case for Molinism here at the moment. And I said this, I said, I don't think that the bullet bill to quo que objection works. And I've explained why this is the case, but let's suppose the argument I've advanced destroying Ed Calvinism also destroys Molinism. So be it. Let's go find truth together. That's what I said. So I'm more committed to the truth, and I expressed this there as well. I'm more committed to the truth than I am to any of my current beliefs. I believe Molinism is the best explanation of all the data. But just as I previously left my dearly held, I would say even my emotionally held beliefs of Calvinism behind because I recognized that it was false, I'm willing to do the same thing with Molinism. I'm not blindly committed to Molinism as a lot of, I see a lot of guys who seem to be blindly and emotionally committed to Calvinism. But I promise, Molinism is not my idol. I just think it's the best explanation of all the data, but I'm always willing to consider more data. I just was talking to one of my open theist friends earlier today, and he thought he had something for me to consider. I looked at it. I don't think it was a good objection. So I'm still a Molinist, but I'm always willing to consider new objections. Anyway, after I explained this at the EPS conference, that was to argue in that manner, using Greg Welty's bullet bill objection, how they were doing it there was fallacious. They got it. They're smart. And then no other philosopher or theologian appealed to Welty's bullet bill objection again against Molinism because they realized that they would be committing the tu quoque fallacy. But a lot of objectors on YouTube still don't seem to have received that memo. So we'll be patient with them while they catch up.
Okay. Yeah, that's my fault. I'm sorry. I'm the YouTuber.
Why is that your fault?
I'm the man. I'm just kidding. I'm not. So because I asked the question, Tim. I asked the question. All right. But now, Tim, you've opened up the door. You've opened up the door and you've brought up Greg Welty's bullet bill objection. Oh, you can? Hold on. Okay. Well, now you've done it, Tim. You have opened up the can of worms. You brought up Greg Welty's bullet bill objection. So people might be watching this and saying, I don't know who Greg Welty is. I don't know what a bullet bill objection is. All I know is I play Mario Kart and sometimes he shows up, right? So can you quickly describe what the objection is and explain how it fails?
Yeah. So in a nutshell, Welty contends that Molinism does not successfully absolve God of responsibility for evil because on Molinism, God knowingly actualizes a world where he infallibly middle knows and foreknows how every creature would and will freely act. If a person analogous to Bullet Bill commits evil in this world, it happens exactly as God knew when choosing to create that world. And this raises the question, how is this a meaningful difference from divine determinism, where God causally determines all evil actions and all false beliefs and things like that? Well, Welty's point is that if God's middle knowledge is certain and infallible, then human choices in any given situation could never have been otherwise. Even if humans are free in a libertarian sense before God creates the world, once he selects a particular world to actualize, their actions unfold inevitably, although they are not determined and they don't unfold necessarily. They're still inevitable, even though they're not determined by God. If that's the case, Welty argues that Molinism doesn't really solve the problem of divine responsibility for evil. It just shifts the mechanism, as it were, from direct causation and necessitation to certain foreknowledge combined with world selection. So the one advancing Bullet Bill is essentially arguing, well, If God is evil and not worthy of praise on Calvinism, he's also evil and not worthy of praise on Molinism. With that said, allow me to explain why Molinism has not been shot by Bullet Bill. To put it simply, on Molinism, God is merely a necessary condition for Bullet Bill's free choices, not to mention all of Bill's false theological beliefs. On Ed Calvinism, God is both necessary and sufficient for all the evil, pain, and suffering in the world. All of Bullet Bill's actions, not to mention all of Bill's false theological beliefs. So that's a vital difference, and it makes a huge difference. And it doesn't take a PhD to grasp this difference. Indeed, nearly everyone who watched the most viewed movies in the history of movies can see the vital difference here. So consider the Marvel movies: Captain America, Civil War, and Avengers Infinity War, and Avengers Endgame. So we can compare and contrast Hydra with Doctor Strange here and consider the intuitions of the vast majority of moviegoers. As I explained to James White in our debate,
And then he
Hydra,
got mad at you.
he did get mad at me
Yeah.
about this. And I think one of the reasons is because this clearly shows the difference between Molinism and Calvinism here, and why his view fails, and why the Calvinist and why the Molinist view seems to make sense, right? So yeah, this is what I explained to James White. Hydra deterministically mind-controlled Bucky and Captain America's Civil War. And this is why everybody in the movie theater realized that Stark was wrong and losing his mind and just plain wrong when he was trying to kill Bucky, right? He should have been going after the victimizer, not the victim. Captain America, on the other hand, correctly realized that Bucky was the victim of Hydra here, who determined Bucky's mental actions, which then led to his physical actions, which then eventually killed Stark's parents. You can see the domino effect there. And moviegoers cheered for Captain America as he fought Stark, really, almost to the death, fought him to protect Bucky from Tony Stark, because everybody in the movie theater realized that Hydra was the source of Bucky's mental and physical actions. It wasn't Bucky's fault. He did not deserve blame here. Now, compare and contrast Hydra with Doctor Strange's actions in Infinity War and Endgame. Doctor Strange merely created a feasible, freedom-permitting world in which he knew that although evil would occur, it would lead to the best feasible endgame, hence the title of the movie. And that's why Marvel fans all had the intuition that Hydra is evil and Doctor Strange is a hero. I don't know if you've seen those clips on YouTube from the people recording the end of Endgame, and you'll just hear, I've never seen movie theaters erupt like this. It was like this for me at the movie theater here in Nebraska when I was watching it too on opening night. The place went nuts. It was like you were at the Super Bowl and you just saw somebody win on a last second Hail Mary play or something. It was crazy just how loud the crowd got, because they all realized that Doctor Strange is the hero here. And so you can see the difference between a mere necessary condition, right? Doctor Strange was the necessary condition of all the evil that happened in the movie Endgame, but he was not the necessary and sufficient condition. But when Bucky killed Tony Stark's parents, it was Hydra who was the necessary and sufficient condition, right? So there's a difference here, and people can see this intuitively. And so because of this, I say that the Avengers have soundly defeated Bullet Bill. With all that said, as to why Welty's Bullet Bill objection fails, let me reiterate that I'm not arguing for Molinism here. I'm arguing against Ed Calvinism. So offering the, well, what about Molinism? If it's a problem for me, it's a problem for you. No. That's a tu quoque fallacy, right? That's a fallacious move. Just saying, what about you, does not solve the problem that I've demonstrated that you had. But look, I'm willing to have that conversation and explain why that's not a problem for me. But you don't get to make that move without first getting off the hook I just put you on. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. I think it does. We'll see if the viewers do. So if you think it makes sense, like the video, share the video. If you don't think it makes sense, put a comment in the comments below. Say, hey, this particular thing did not make sense. I'd love to hear more of an explanation on this. Or you can angrily comment or whatever. All comments are welcome, except for really inappropriate ones. We would love to interact with you there. And I think we've shown that we're not taking philosophy and imposing it on Scripture. What we're doing is recognizing that philosophy is necessary to be able to go to Scripture, and then we can make sense of what Scripture has to say. So all of that to say, I think that what we've done here today, hopefully, is to show that. And we hope that you like, you share, and subscribe to the channel. And also, as we always say here at FreeThinking Ministries,
stay
reasonable.